Current US-China relations, Cold War or hot peace? Source, Michael Hirsh. No, this is not a Cold War, yet. Foreign policy. Why are anti-China hawks exaggerating the threat from Beijing? In the past few years, experts have begun to operate at full capacity on the China issue. A new generation of scholars, government officials, and journalists is building on the idea that America has entered a new Cold War, with China taking on the role of the former Soviet Union, and Russia, although weak, he still plays the role of an enthusiastic and helpful companion. Tons of books and newspapers were sold, dozens of weapons systems were developed, including America's first new nuclear warhead in decades, and many individuals were promoted and given tenure. Ironically, at a time of intense political polarization in Washington, there is no greater consensus between Democrats and Republicans than the idea that China is aggressively trying to replace the United States as the global hegemony. We are confronting Beijing, and it is safe to say that if former President Donald Trump is elected 6 months from now, the overall situation will not be peaceful. In an essay in the May/June issue of Foreign Affairs magazine, Trump's former Deputy National Security Advisor Matt Pottinger, who is likely to be appointed in a second Trump administration, criticized the hawkish member of the Biden administration is not hawkish enough. In an article with Mike Gallagher, the recently retired but still influential former chairman of the House Committee on the Communist Party of China, Pottinger came very close to calling for regime change in Beijing, quoting to quote General Douglas MacArthur's Cold War cry, "There is no substitute for victory." Key U.S. allies such as Britain are also sympathetic to the new wave of hawks. Among those who support this Cold War perspective is Robin Niblett, a research fellow at the London-based Chatham Institute. What can we do to avoid falling into a second Cold War? Niblett asks in his new book, The New Cold War, how the contest between the US and China will shape our century. How? No, there is nothing we can do, he wrote, because the problem is that these two countries are on opposite sides of a far-reaching and never-ending global competition between two political systems incompatible and hostile to each other. The new Cold War has truly begun, Niblett declared. In some ways, this is simply a repeat of the harsh statements we heard during the First Cold War, although this time, it's more of a joke than a tragedy. Please recall how Washington and Beijing suspended relations at one point because of a balloon flying in the wrong direction. The problem with this view is that the most compelling evidence tells us that it is not true, at least not yet, and that current relations between the United States and China remain more like a cold peace. The biggest mistake the new Cold War camp made was in arguing that, of course, there were significant differences from the previous Cold War, but these differences would not prevent a new Cold War. Niblett actually spends most of his book talking about those differences, and he does a good job of detailing them, and then finally warns, don't let conflict with China become a self-fulfilling prophecy. But that warning may have come too late. The Cold War analogy keeps popping up. In a famous essay published in 2019 in Foreign Affairs magazine, Jake Sullivan and Kurt Campbell, who later became President Joe Biden's National Security Advisor and Chief Asia Advisor, respectively, even suggested that China may eventually pose a stronger ideological challenge than the Soviet Union. Their argument then was that China's combination of authoritarian capitalism and digital surveillance capabilities could somehow be more durable and more attractive than Marxism. Turns out that's not the case, for reasons I'll get to later. But the point is this: the differences between the two eras are so profound that they are evidence in favor of a cold peace rather than a Cold War. And there is a huge difference between those two terms. Cold War means openly fighting for complete dominance in military and other fields. It means constant internal interference in rival states through covert operations and living with the ever-present threat of destruction in a world rife with nuclear danger. On the other hand, the Cold Peace means that rival powers generally avoid the use of military force and focus on non-repressive forms of geopolitical competition. People. The competition is determined by which side has the most influence within a commonly agreed upon international system. A Cold War is always zero-sum, but in a Cold Peace, there are no winners and no finish line. It's a lot less exciting, but a lot less people die. What we have now is still closer to Cold Peace, as I will explain. Yet China hawks in Washington, and one can barely turn a corner in the U.S. Capitol without encountering a China hawk, seem to believe that we are in a Cold War. Why is there so little debate on this should be controversial issue? Part of the reason for what is happening today is the overreaction of American and Western officials when they discovered that Beijing had no intention of being a responsible stakeholder in the world problems, as Washington once expected after the Cold War. Instead, China, with an increasingly tough government, has become the boss and main sponsor of a new era of authoritarian regimes and human rights repression, even flagrant violations of international standards. International trade rules. Senior U.S. officials and lawmakers in both parties were embarrassed by their naivete, as were all credulous pundits, and perhaps no rage was more intense than the rage of the betrayed. After Biden entered the White House, Campbell, who has long advocated a hawkish stance on China, was convinced that he was no fool when he declared in 2021 that the widely described period is that engagement with China is over. However, things are not necessarily like that. As journalist David Sanger wrote in one of the more balanced and far-sighted books in the New Wave, New Cold Wars, China's Rise, Russia's Invasion, and America's Struggle to Defend the West. China's Rise, Russia's Invasion, and America's Struggle to Defend the West. After a hostile first meeting with the Chinese delegation in Alaska in 2021, administration officials Biden has gradually realized that China is perhaps not as formidable as they thought, and Beijing still seems willing to negotiate to find a viable way out. There are certainly plenty of reasons to think that the US and China are still on the road to a Cold War, or worse, whether you like it or not. This is especially true in the context of the growing arms race, most recently with the appearance of new Chinese hypersonic missiles, which threaten to become aircraft carrier killers in the East Sea. Over the past few years, satellite photos have also stunned the national security community in Washington by revealing China's impressive and highly secretive buildup of its nuclear arsenal, which may include up to 300 new missile silos. In response, Biden is upgrading America's nuclear arsenal, including the development of the country's first new nuclear warhead in 40 years, the W-93, B-61-13 nuclear gravity bomb, 400 ground-launched intercontinental ballistic missiles, a fleet of nuclear-armed strategic submarines, a new strategic bomber, B-21, and air-launched cruise missiles. Additionally, Biden has come closer than any previous president to violating long-standing U.S. policy of strategic ambiguity and has publicly pledged to defend Taiwan, despite Chinese military increased threats and military exercises. All of which could mean that the two countries could one day skip the cold part and go straight into a hot war. At the same time, despite Biden's denials that he does not want a new Cold War, U.S. and Western policies have in fact confirmed to Beijing that a Cold War is underway, with consensus. Reluctance of America's Pacific allies such as Japan and South Korea. Nothing conveys this message more directly than NATO's decision in mid-2022 to expand its focus to the Asia-Pacific region. China's sense that Washington is quietly imposing a Cold War-style containment policy on the country has been reinforced by groups such as AUKUS, a trilateral security pact between Australia, the UK, and the US, and the Quartet between the US, Japan, India, and Australia. Additionally, it is clear that China and Russia will remain allied to a certain extent, if not yet completely militarily. Both countries will continue to strive to balance American hegemony, and trying to divide them is probably as futile as dividing the European Union from the United States. Despite its refusal to deliver large-scale weapons systems to Russia and Ukraine, China still provides financing and more equipment and spare parts, as U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken alleged after more than 5 hours of meetings talked to Foreign Minister Wang Yi, within the framework of his visit to China at the end of April to meet with President Xi Jinping. In a press conference, Blinken accused China of fueling Russia's devastating aggression against Ukraine by becoming a leading supplier of machine tools, electronic components, nitrocellulose, key chemicals for making ammunition and rocket propellants, as well as other dual-use items that Moscow is using to bolster its defense industrial base. Trade between China and Russia reached a record $240.1 billion in 2023, up sharply from a year earlier. So why don't I think a Cold War is coming? During the same visit to China, Blinken also praised Beijing's significant influence in moving Russia away from considering using nuclear weapons in the Ukraine conflict, and he also praised North Korea for urging Iran not to escalate against Israel. Michael Doyle, an international relations expert at Columbia University, said that distinguishing between China's and Russia's goals in the current environment is extremely important. Russia is a rogue, and China is an opponent. I think that's a pretty good summary, Doyle, who is also the author of Cold Peace, Avoiding the New Cold War, said in an interview. Interview with Foreign Policy. We are essentially engaged in the most extreme Cold War-level conflict with Russia, he added, a conflict not unlike the proxy wars in Vietnam and Afghanistan during the period before. But with China, things are very different, Doyle observed. China has benefited greatly from its integration into the world economy, and in the future, China wants to play a leading role in the world economy. So China wouldn't want to destroy the world, that's pretty clear. And it means there is a big push against the militarists in China who want to assert China's prestige and power in the Eastern Pacific. What about the idea that the US and Chinese systems are incompatible and mutually hostile, in Niblet's words? In terms of political ideology, this is true to some extent, although perhaps not as true as Niblet and many experts believe. We'll get to that later. But in other respects, when it comes to economics and especially finance and trade, the idea is much more controversial. Over the past few years, a series of unprecedented export restrictions have been imposed by Washington and European governments to ensure that Western businesses do not share sensitive technologies with Beijing. These businesses are also reducing their dependence on Chinese imports in key sectors such as telecommunications, infrastructure, and raw materials. But this decoupling, or as Biden's team likes to call it, de-risking, is still taking place on the margins. The U.S. Department of Commerce reported that in 2022, total two-way trade between the U.S. and China set a new record of $690 billion. Even Apple's iPhone, a device that millions of Americans depend on to manage everything from their financial lives to their medical records to the apps that help them open their homes, Sanger writes, is still largely assembled in China, and the company is in no rush to change that. She seems to be gradually understanding this interdependence better, especially as he watches his economy decline. That was certainly one reason for Xi's recent trip to Europe, either to attract investment, or in the vain hope that he could drive a wedge between the European Union and the United States. But Xi is facing a very different environment from what he experienced during his visit to Europe in 2019. At that time, Europe and Washington had major differences over how tough they should be on Beijing. To what extent, but today, that dissent has almost disappeared, while distrust of China has increased. In a move that shows Beijing's waning influence, Xi limited his visit to two small and somewhat sympathetic countries, Hungary and Serbia, along with a third country, France, with President Emmanuel Macron, who has cautiously tried to nudge the EU towards greater independence from Washington. Indeed, given the level of integration and mutual benefits for each economy participating in the global market, it is clear that the strategic threat that China and the United States pose to each other is much less than the threat that China and the United States pose to each other. Threat that each country faces if it fails to cooperate. This is especially true when it comes to preventing climate change and future pandemics, as well as stabilizing regions that each side wants to exploit commercially, specifically the South. Direct conflict, as opposed to competition economic, will not help either side. More importantly, both the US and Chinese governments recognize this, which helps explain why the trade war initiated by Trump did not get worse. And what about the ideological challenge that is said to come from China? In an article published on the front page of the May/June issue of Foreign Affairs titled "Can China Remake the World? Can China Reshape the World?", Elizabeth Economy of the Hoover Institution goes even further than Sullivan, Campbell, and many other experts in some respects, arguing that what Xi is pursuing is nothing less than a reshaping of the entire post-war system. Xi Jinping's ambition to reshape the world is undeniable, she wrote. But economy, with his reputation as a careful scholar, ultimately downplayed his own argument, noting that Beijing's various efforts to replace U.S.-led post-war power structures leadership, including the Belt and Road, global development, global security, and global civilization initiatives, appear to be failing or counterproductive. Indeed, the evidence suggests that China, along with Russia, is failing to build a significant counterweight to long-standing Western institutions, including NATO, the United Nations, and the United Nations. OECD Economic Cooperation and Development. It is true that many countries, especially in the South, have sought to maintain a state of non-alignment between the two powers. India, in particular, is treading carefully on a complicated middle path, participating in Washington's quadrilateral security dialogue, though not as a defense ally, while continuing to maintain relations. Strong economy with Russia as a balance with China. Xi continues to stumble even as he has won the support of other authoritarian leaders. Over the years, he has brought them an ideological mess, a nasty mix of bribery, intimidation, and bullying that few countries would tolerate. Of course, sometimes they will defer to China to maintain its good support. For example, at its annual summit in Johannesburg in 2023, the BRICS Forum of 5 major emerging economies, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, announced it would admit 6 members. New, ostensibly to create a balance of power with the West led by the US. New entrants include Iran, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, UAE, Egypt, Ethiopia, and Argentina, although Argentina later reversed its decision. On paper, this expansion seems worrying for the West, since it includes 6 of the world's top 10 oil producers, nearly half of the world's population, and 37% of its total output. Global domestic market, measured by purchasing power parity. In reality, however, BRICS expansion has far less geopolitical weight than the Cold War-era non-aligned movement, according to foreign policy columnist and strategist C. Raja Mohan. Famous Indian family. Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE are close security partners of the United States, Mohan wrote. Despite their differences with Washington, they are unlikely to give up U.S. security guarantees in exchange for China's unproven promises, let alone being protected by the BRICS potato sack. Clearly, despite its rhetoric, China is actually doing little to replace the international system that the United States and other Western powers have created. Instead, China's intention seems to be to beat America at its own game within that system. Many experts say Beijing really has no other choice if it wants to maintain its economy. But even in that match, Xi scored as many own goals as Washington has in recent years. During the Chinese president's 2019 visit to Europe, Italy signed on to join the Belt and Road Initiative, a large-scale Chinese-led global infrastructure project designed to win friends, and put them in debt, becoming the first G7 country to do so. But by the end of 2023, Rome decided to withdraw because it did not see any real benefits. Another major Chinese initiative with the European Union, the Comprehensive Agreement on Investment, also quietly died after Beijing refused to condemn Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Today, the United States has more than 50 allies and strategic partners around the world, including some countries, such as the Philippines, that are located on China's periphery, and were previously wary of Washington but are now wary of Washington. Strengthened security treaties because of concerns about Beijing. Most of them, including the 32 wealthy NATO countries, are the richest countries in the world. By contrast, China's main allies are North Korea, with its economy ranked 125th in the world by nominal GDP, and Russia, with an economy the size of Texas, said Randall Schweller, a political science at Ban University G. Ohio, writes in a forthcoming academic paper titled The Age of Unbalanced Polarity. As a result, even the West's traditional sphere of influence is beyond Beijing's reach, Schweller concluded. Besieged by major powers, with the economy weighed down by inefficient capital markets, ruled by a leader who repeatedly reverses economic reforms and strengthens economic policies' state economy, China is likely to remain a weak number 2 in an unbalanced bipolar system. In other words, it is not the same as it was at the height of the Cold War, when, as John F. Kennedy said in October 1960 while running for president, the world seemed ready for war. Winning hearts and minds, that the concern of much of the world is which system works better, communism or liberalism. Can our system help the world solve its problems, or must they turn to the East? Not many people turn to the East these days. And we shouldn't worry that it will happen anytime soon. So why do many observers view the conflict in the worst possible light? To clarify, I myself used the term Cold War in a 2022 essay after NATO moved to the Asia-Pacific, but I criticized this move and argued that view the idea of a Cold War as inevitable as a failure of the imagination and political courage of the American president and of other great powers. To be sure, the hawks are far outnumbered by the small minority of scholars and experts who still insist that we are facing a cold peace, not a Cold War, among them Fareed Zakaria of CNN, which first used the term in 2021, recently called Pottinger and Gallagher's proposals thoughtless, dangerous, and completely impractical. The biggest problem is that the idea of a new Cold War is just a fad, and the long-standing policies of both sides, Washington and Beijing, have gradually rendered the term meaningless. In an interview with Foreign Policy, Schweller said that when he first entered the academic job market in 1993, shortly after the collapse of the Soviet Union, international security studies were on the rise. Cold, but now, they're hot again. Promoting the idea of Cold War 2.0 will certainly advance the careers of international security scholars, Schweller wrote in an email. And that's true in China, too, according to political scientist Ian A. Zhou from Cornell University. The hawks in the competing countries all benefit from each other in their internal battles, she said in a phone interview. Like Soviet and American hardliners during the Cold War, China's militarists are eager to promote the idea that America is seeking to contain China. The deep ideological tensions between the two countries today are more likely a product of this dynamic, not of China actively promoting becoming a world power, Zhou said. How dangerous could the situation between Washington and Beijing be? In his book, Sanger, a longtime New York Times reporter with access to senior officials in the Biden administration, does an excellent job following the Biden administration as it gradually realizes that she is no longer a giant. Like other observers, Sanger acknowledged Biden as having constructed a credible game plan to overcome Beijing, but concluded that confusion about risks still prevails in Washington. Biden's cabinet members do not share a common understanding of what constitutes engagement with China. Under Biden, US-China relations have followed a highly tense trajectory, starting in Alaska in 2021 and ending with Xi's modest appearance in San Francisco at the Asia-Pacific Cooperation Forum Yang in late 2023, when the Chinese leader publicly begged American tech investors to return. Xi's decision to abandon wolf warrior diplomacy and lure American investors back to China marked the first time in decades that a Chinese leader had stepped foot into a summit meeting, Sanger wrote. Knowing that he is in a weak position, he seems increasingly desperate for American help. Over the past year or so, Beijing has also begun to signal that it does not want to invade Taiwan as soon as possible, given the risk of additional economic sanctions at a time when the Chinese economy is only growing at 2% to 3% per year, instead of 8%. Xi must be wondering whether his generals overestimate the People's Liberation Army's skills. No, the way Russian President Vladimir Putin's generals have predicted a flash war in Ukraine, Sanger wrote, quoting a Biden official, "We might have more time we think." Over the past year or so, China under Xi has seemed ready to negotiate arms control. Sanger writes, suddenly, the Chinese seemed, vaguely, interested in some kind of dialogue, perhaps because they did not want to engage in a costly arms race, or perhaps because the close military alliance between Washington and Tokyo has given America new counterattack capabilities. Another factor that opens the door for some much-needed realpolitik with China is Biden's abandonment of his Cold War-style rhetoric, the idea that we are in a world of two democratic and autocratic blocs. Especially facing the threat of Trump returning to the U.S. presidency in November, it is clear that we live in a diverse spectrum of political ideologies and practices, stretching from the liberal democracies of the West to the United States, West to the autocratic regimes of Russia and China, and plenty of hybrid regimes in between, such as India, Hungary, and Brazil. Indeed, since the credibility of American democracy itself is in question, it is reasonable to hope that both sides will admit that neither system is perfect. It can also make finding a way to live together easier. The Chinese despise democracy, and Americans despise tyranny, but we Americans are now enduring the pitfalls of democracy, just as Xi and those under him are facing them. Face the shortcomings of authoritarian regimes. Sanger's book makes clear that China is still applying Cold War-style tactics, including injecting malware into U.S. infrastructure, perhaps to test ways to slow down the response by the United States against an invasion of Taiwan. And we should at least draw a parallel with the First Cold War. Neither side has the capacity to dare miss the opportunity to ensure that we maintain the Cold Peace, instead of entering a new Cold War. I see a particular parallel with the late 1940s, when the threat posed by Joseph Stalin and the Soviet Union was still relatively unclear, said Doyle, the Columbia University expert. I think that's the world we live in today. There are legitimate warnings about the nature of competition with Russia and China. But we need to relearn the lessons of détente, at the same time as the lessons of the Cold War. And peace is something we should do now instead of waiting 20 years. Michael Hirsh is a columnist for Foreign Policy. He is the author of 2 books, Capital Offense, How Washington's Wise Men Turned America's Future Over to Wall Street, and At War with Ourselves, Why America is Squandering Its Chance to Build a Better World.